Hello. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about DBT skills for climate distress. So before we get into this, although this webinar may have a therapeutic value and discuss the therapy modality, it does not constitute therapy, you being in therapy, or me being your therapist. This webinar is for educational purposes only. And if you'd like to find a climate aware therapist, check out the Climate Psychology Alliance directory. So they have, there's providers all over the country that have approaches that acknowledge the mental health impacts of climate change. So this is an area usually where people might also say, like, if you're in crisis, call the hotline. However, if you are experiencing distress and would like support, it's important to understand there are risks with calling suicide hotlines. Often these hotlines use call tracing and can involve police. And unfortunately, if you keep up with the news, you might know that this can be a risk to your life, particularly if you are from certain marginalized communities. So this link here that I will list in the notes gives more detailed options for accessing support with support lines that are upfront about their policies when you call for support. Now, even with that being said, I recently saw someone critique this link and say that some of these links still have people that are mandated reporters, which means they may be mandated by the state to report certain things to authorities. So there is an alternative link that I will also share that they recommended. So unfortunately, when you're accessing support, this is the reality of how to protect yourself and take care of yourself and what's best for you. So I just wanted to bring a little bit more nuance to that and acknowledgement of the harm that has been done in the mental health field and how it has criminalized and endangered people that are struggling. So a little bit more about climate change and climate distress. Imagine that you're seeking this out because you are experiencing emotions related to climate change, or you want to learn more about it because it's an issue that maybe someone that you care about is struggling with. So, depending on where people live and what they care about, the emotions associated or distress associated with climate change can vary widely. Um, it's a growing area of research in terms of even coming up with terminology, what people are gathering data about what people are actually experiencing, and to sort of explore what impacts people's action or inaction, and then also even what types of therapy or developing new types of therapy might be helpful. Uh, in some ways, we're on sort of the cutting edge of this, and that there's not a lot of really established, like, these are the practices, these are the therapies that really are effective. And part of the reason for that is that we are facing a level of existential threat that really the mental health field, as it looks like currently in the profession, was not really developed to address these kind of issues or acknowledging these kind of issues. I'll probably get into that in another talk about some of the issues with depoliticizing therapy and the history of therapy, and there's all sorts of problems with that. But just to even acknowledge, like, this is where we're at. And so a lot of therapists are trying, therapists that are aware of these things, that are supporting clients with these issues, they're really developing new, trying out different things and developing new ideas and concepts and how we can really support people as we're facing this major challenge. One of the things that we do acknowledge as climate aware therapists is that these emotions are not irrational, they're not people being sick or something being messed up with them, that these are natural reactions to what is occurring. And again, that's another area where therapy is often more focused on when we have emotional reactions that don't quite fit our situation. A lot of therapies are sort of developed around that concept. And there's a lot of issues with that too. But just to say that we're having to get creative. And so some of the terms that have been discussed are climate anxiety or eco anxiety, eco grief, terra fury, which is anger related to these situations. Um, and then I also wanted to talk about environmental racism as well. So depending on where you live, you may have different experiences of this. So if I'm thinking about a white European in the global north versus a person of the global majority living in the global south, they may have very different experiences with climate change. So one of the critiques of a term like eco-anxiety is it's really focused on the experiences of white people in the global north and this sort of fear about a future thing, like an uncertainty about how bad things are going to be or what things are going to look like. Whereas if you're looking at the experience of someone in the global south, a person of the global majority, that they are experiencing detrimental impacts of climate change today in many of these communities and regions. And on top of those present uh, disasters that are having, they also have the experience of experiencing the worst impacts and having contributed the least to these problems. So that can add a whole nother layer of emotions on top of the history of exploitation of many of these communities by the global north. And I'm trying to get more. I was challenged by an Indigenous teacher recently to sort of clarify that I mean white people with that, because even within, like, if you're looking at Turtle Island, what is now commonly referred to as the US, people can have very different experiences depending on what communities they are part of and where they're living. So, someone that's living in an area that is experiencing more natural disasters, more frequent, more intense disasters, there potentially is going to be more trauma and emotional experience with that versus someone who's not in a region that is experiencing more of that. Or if you're thinking about someone in an indigenous community that is having their community deeply impacted by rising sea levels, for example, and that having a significant impact on many areas of their lives. So, depending on where people live, they may have different experiences, and that may contribute to different feelings that they have. So, I just wanted to acknowledge that complexity, that it's not always feeling one way, that people have different experiences. Some of the research that we're gathering about, the numbers here, 17 to 27% of the US sample reported some degree of climate anxiety. An international study of 10,000 young people from 10 different countries reporting a high rate of climate anxiety. 45% of young people reporting it had a negative impact on their lives. Another study in 2022 showing that the majority of Americans are at least somewhat worried about global warming. So, growing numbers, even in the couple of studies I'm showing here, we've got a growing number of people that are concerned about these issues, and maybe because more people are experiencing more firsthand things or witnessing more things. And then on top of these concerns or these feelings that people may be having, there is also the impact of what leadership and governments are doing. So there is a significant level of invalidation. So, from leadership, from governments, that can vary, maybe from the level of a lack of acknowledgement to all out dismissal. And then there's also inaction. So either not acting at all, either not acting in a way that is can meaningfully impact what we're dealing with, or even doing things that counter what needs to be done, investing in things that are causing these issues. So just to note from an emotional experience, like this has a significant impact when people are there's not this validation, there's not this acknowledgement of how they're feeling, that can add even more distress and more sense of isolation and hopelessness to what people are feeling, whether they're interacting with friends or family members that are not acknowledging these things and concerned about them, or they are in a community where government is not really addressing these concerns, that can even more so intensify those feelings. So, dialectical behavioral therapy, so that's what DBT stands for, is a pretty well established and researched modality developed by Dr. Marsha Linehan. Just to say that this offering is not a full DBT treatment program, that is becoming more noted as a thing to say. I could have a lot of opinions about that, but I'm just going to say that. So full DBT treatment is pretty extensive, including individual and group sessions weekly, coaching calls in between, having a treatment team. So it is a pretty intense therapy modality. So that would be the full treatment, whereas here we're just talking about some of the skills that are involved. And similarly, if you are interested in finding a DBT therapist, I can put up some links as well if you want to look around for that. So this therapy modality was developed for individuals who had pretty severe issues with emotion management, people that were in and out of the hospital due to safety concerns, and trauma histories. So what I like to think about it is that, okay, if it's working for people that are at that level of severity, that doesn't mean that you're at that level of severity, but it means that, oh, maybe those things would be helpful for other people. A lot of these skills are sort of general emotion management skills that I think can be helpful for most people. I've often said, like, why isn't this just taught in school? Like these are it's sort of accumulation of multiple skills that can be really helpful for people in navigating life. So the skills are focused on managing our mood symptoms and relationships, and also taking more of a balanced approach to facing life's challenges. So people that are in this pretty extreme emotional states, they are some ways we can think about as sort of there's an imbalance in their life, and sometimes by bringing in these skills that can help them move towards more of a sense of balance in terms of how they approach things and deal with difficult situations. So many, and I just want to acknowledge that many of the underlying principles of DBT were developed from Buddhist psychology. So concepts of mindfulness, radical acceptance, that are woven throughout DBT are really from this root source. And unfortunately, often that is not acknowledged, but that is important and an avenue potentially if you find that you are interested in learning more about mindfulness. An avenue is to study more Buddhist psychology and philosophy. So the different modules that we cover in DBT are mindfulness. There's many things that we can gain from a mindfulness practice, and it's really the foundation for all the other skills that we sort of have to be aware of, or have a certain level of self-awareness to even know that something's happening for us and that it might be helpful to have a skill to help us deal with whatever situation is going on. So the emotion regulation section is about getting to know and understand our emotions and different skills to manage our emotions. Interpersonal effectiveness is looking at different communication skills that we can bring into our lives and in different difficult situations to be able to communicate more effectively. And distress tolerance is split up into two sections. There are the crisis survival skills, which are for those really intense, distressing moments. And then there's also the reality acceptance skills, which are about how do we accept the things, how do we come to terms with the things in life that we cannot change? Which there's many different things that happen through life that probably everyone at some point is challenged to face that. So I want to acknowledge a piece here. So DBT doesn't work for everyone, and not every skill works for everyone, and not every skill will be helpful to everyone. So if we're looking at this, if we're inviting in an acknowledgement of neurodivergence, that people have different brains, they have different nervous systems, they have different needs, they have different sensitivities, that some of these skills may be more or less helpful. And I will also note in the resources a neurodivergent affirming workbook for DBT and resource if you want to look into that. I'm not going to get into as much of that today, but I just want to acknowledge that, like the Buddha says, take what works for you, spit the rest. So these are just some ideas, and if you're interested, I'll be giving you resources to dig into more in some. There's actually a few pretty helpful websites that look into self-therapy or self-help stuff that you can look into and kind of explore more of like how these skills might be more helpful or less helpful for you. And if you want to connect with a therapist to dig into more of the DBT skills. So mindfulness. So mindfulness is really commonly talked about today. It's sort of, you might notice like it's everywhere. At least since I've been working as a therapist. I think that probably when I started about 10 years ago, it was really taking off, and there's more and more research every year about the benefits of this practice and different things that it has helped with. So similarly to so I guess I'll just go back to saying like this is the a big piece that's coming from Buddhist psychology. And I want to acknowledge the limitations of decontextualizing a practice that sometimes it is taught and shared in ways that are not really in line with the intention of the practice, and can actually be used in harmful ways. So, um, I'll get too much into that, but I just want to say, like, with any of these things, is to really check in with yourself about, like, does this work for me or not? And there's lots of different ways that you can practice mindfulness and explore and think about, like, what's a practice that feels good for you, and even holding the complexity that in some moments or some types of situations, it might be helpful and sometimes it may not be. And that's why it's important to have a toolbox of many different things and items that you can use. So mindfulness, the definition or one way to define it is it's paying attention to the present moment in some type of way. And when you're doing that, trying to take a non-judgmental stance, sort of letting go of the good and bad evaluations and just being with what is. Part of just being with what is allowing whatever you're noticing or experiencing to develop and shift and evolve in different ways without attachment, without trying to hold it or cling to it being just one sort of way. So this is where we're already starting to be invited into an acceptance practice. The acceptance that things are constantly changing. So some of the ways that we may be suffering is because we are very attached to things being one way or staying the way that they have been. And that is a big thing with the climate distress and climate change that we're experiencing is that things are rapidly changing. And that doesn't necessarily mean you agree with it. That doesn't mean that you agree that things should be happening. It's coming to terms with where we're actually at. And we'll talk about that more with radical acceptance, but just to get that started. So sometimes this practice can be relaxing, and it's important to acknowledge, because this is how the practice is often sold, is that this is going to make you feel calm. And it doesn't always do that, because just paying attention to the moment is not always calming if we're experiencing something difficult, a difficult emotion. And it's great when sometimes it does feel calming, but to be mindful of any expectation that you have on the practice, because that's not really what it's for. It's really to work on building your sense of self-awareness of what's going on with you. Are there patterns? Are there patterns in your thinking? The more awareness you have, the more choice you have in terms of how you respond to things. And over time, as you're working on opening to the present moment, this can help you increase your capacity to stay with what is. Some of the times we get into trouble because we fall into this trap, which is just part of having a nervous system that doesn't want to feel uncomfortable, it doesn't want to feel afraid, is we do things to avoid how we're feeling, to distract ourselves. And sometimes that is effective. Sometimes that is the most effective thing to do. And sometimes it's not, because what that might do is pull us away from our values. The things that we might do, the consequences that might come from distracting ourselves might pull us in a direction that does not really fit with our values. And that's a big thing we can talk about in this situation, because often people get pulled into strategies that aren't engaging with this, aren't engaging with climate change, working on it and addressing it, and pulling them away from that. And so they're not really living in a way that's in line with their values, because they're overwhelmed by the situation, which is totally understandable. So the other thing that mindfulness can really help us to do is that, we say that we care. I've noticed this over the years, per cycle going by, that we say we care about the earth. Where are we at in terms of our active relationship with the earth, the universe, to these beings that we care about, that we want to save, we want to preserve, we want to protect? What does that relationship look like? Are we engaging with them? Are we listening to them about how to address these issues, how to move forward? That is something that can come from your practice, is taking these mindfulness skills to listening to the land. I find that these relationships, there's so much wisdom in these relationships, and that is unfortunately one of the things that many of us have lost in modern culture, is how to be in active relationship with the land, and how to engage those relationships in a way that is honoring and respectful of them. I talk about this more in some of my other talks, but just to say that mindfulness can be an avenue for us to build relationships, so that we are moving more in a way that is in community, versus just feeling like we are on our own. So these practices can also help with regrounding in stressful moments. So some of the mindfulness practices can help us ground back into ourselves. Another thing that mindfulness can help us with is, so I did already just actually talk about interconnectedness, but also compassion. So some people really struggle with compassion, because they think that it is about like just being okay with everything and letting ourselves off the hook. I'll also give a note about the work of Dr. Kristin Neff on self-compassion, and So basically, from her research, she's found that a lot of people think like, oh, if I beat myself up, then I'll do better, I'll change. What actually it does is it tends to lead to depression and inaction. So the shaming of ourselves if we're not doing what we want to do, if we're not following through or following up in ways that we'd like to, or as active in ways that we'd like to, shaming ourselves actually is not helpful. It may actually lead to more inaction. And so self compassion may be a more effective avenue for us to really be honest with ourselves. Because self compassion is not just letting yourself off the hook. It's not like, I'm okay with everything, I'm okay with doing nothing. It's being real about where are we actually at? What is our context? How challenging is it to do the things that we're expecting ourselves to do? And with that non judgmental stance, we can actually address or acknowledge like, what are the barriers to us moving forward and moving in a way that is more in line with our values. So another piece with this, a big piece I literally just referenced is values. So a big part of DBT is trying to get more perspective. So it should take a step back. So we may have strong emotional reactions to things. We may have really strong emotions that are telling us what we should say, what we should do, how we should respond. We may have um, developed a strategy where we're so distanced from our emotions that we're like, just what are the facts? Like, I'm disconnected from our emotions. And what DBT is asking us or encouraging us to think about is there a way to sort of find a balance between both sides of those? What are my emotions telling me? What are the facts or the rules of the situation that I'm in? How can I engage in a way that is balancing both of those and also moving forward in a way that is in line with my goals and my values, honoring my sense of integrity. The DBT term for this is wise mind. So for me, this brings up this concept that I've heard a lot from in different areas of people, areas and spaces of people addressing these environmental issues is this big thing about we don't have time to cry. We don't have time for our emotions. It's just action. Like, get over your emotions. It's an emergency. We just have to act. Hate to break it to you because this is how we've been socialized. We've been socialized with this idea that we can just suppress and get over our emotions. Unfortunately, you can only suppress it for so long before it takes over. And sometimes that has devastating consequences. People get burned out, they develop health issues, they have mental, sort of emotional breakdowns. People get to a point of hopelessness and disconnect that it can be lethal and devastating. Like it can get very severe when we suppress our emotions. And it's sort of this neurobiological fallacy, or that's kind of the way I think about it, is like the way that our systems are set up is that emotions are essential for us. They are part of our survival. They are embedded in who and what we are as human beings. And I could do a whole talk about the connection between suppressing our emotions and climate change. Maybe another talk. Let me make a note of that. But there actually is a connection there. And, but it's not actually really effective. And one of the things that's really brought up with climate psychology is working towards finding a balance around this of action and space to attend to and process our emotions, and taking that space can be really effective because it can actually help us to sustainably engage with the movement. Like, yes, it's an emergency and we need people around for the long haul. So, how do we engage with this work in a way that is sustainable long term? And it does demand that we attend to the emotions because this is a very emotional experience. If we didn't have emotion, we wouldn't do anything about it. And that's one of the things we talk about in DBT is like, what's the purpose of emotions? And one of them is like, it drives action. If you didn't have an emotional reaction to climate change, you wouldn't do anything about it. But what's interesting, though, when you get more in depth into how people's nervous systems are responding to emotions, is that they can be experiencing emotions and not acting, but their nervous system is going into a protective strategy. I don't know if we'll get too much into that today. Well, yes, here we go. Avoidance, distraction, and hopelessness. So, avoidance may be a protective factor because it may be your nervous system saying, hey, this is too much for me. I don't know how to deal with it. So, I'm going to put a wall up and not think about this, not look at it, and not deal with it. And there's all different types of ways in the diversity and complexity of nervous systems that come up with strategies of avoidance. And so that may be some of what we're encountering when we're encountering people that are just like, that's not real. I don't believe in that. And different ways of taking in this information so that it's not perceived as much of a threat to their nervous system. Again, that could be a whole nother talk. But just to point out that if we're not putting in this work to manage our emotions and take care of our nervous systems, that it might really lead into our nervous system taking over for us and making decisions for us, which is like, I'm shutting down, I'm not going there. So, one reason to practice skills. But so the suggestion with DBT is it's probably not possible to always be operating from this wise mind perspective where we are balancing emotions and the facts and reason stuff, but to try to maybe more often be operating from that because it's probably more effective for us in terms of how we are moving forward with things. Another skill that's part of this part of DBT is what we call accumulating positives long term. So it's really orienting our values. So what are my values? Even identifying like, what are your values? What are your values that are coming up surrounding climate change? Like, why is this so important to you? And if we think about and identify our values, then we can develop goals that are based on our values. So value is sort of more of this conceptual thing, whereas a goal is something that is tangible, doable, achievable. So building some goals off of that and then breaking it down into action steps. Like, what are the steps that it would take for me to accomplish this goal? And over time, the more that we are basing our lives on this process where we are focusing our goals or prioritizing our values, that long term, this may lead to positive emotions and feeling positive about our lives over time. And so we can sort of think about how we want to be engaging with the climate crisis. What would help us feel good over the long haul? And we can also think about, I didn't note this skill, but we could also think about like in the short term, there's also accumulating positive short term. And we think about like what brings us joy, like what is meaningful to us. Like there's so many ways that we could engage with working on the climate crisis. And one of the things that comes up for me is like finding something that is meaningful to you personally. And what is your unique contribution to this movement? Because we need that. We need creativity. We need all the ideas to address this major crisis that we're facing. So emotion regulation. There's a lot of skills in this module. So I'm just going to briefly And just to say again, like these are some brief overviews. I'm going to give you some resources for um, websites where you can dig into more. And also, if you want to find a therapist to dig into this more, and how you can more personally apply it to your life. So, mindfulness of emotion. So, one of the ways that we can work with managing our emotions is get to know our emotions more. So, when I say, like, I'm feeling anxious, when I'm feeling angry, what is the data that I am gathering to put together that I'm feeling that way? What's going on in my thoughts? What's going on in terms of body sensations? What am I feeling the urge to do? There's so many pieces of our emotional experience that we can build awareness around to help us learn more about patterns in our emotional experience and maybe what are the most effective ways of managing those patterns, and what skills can we bring in to support us with managing those emotions. So we already talked about with this area, there are serious issues with validation because in a community level, in a political, governmental level, we're not seeing the change that many of us are wanting to see or the action. And even sometimes are dismissed, we're dismissed or diminished for acknowledging the science and the reality. And so hopefully over time we can find people in our lives that will give us more will validate us, that share our views and our understanding of reality. We can also work on self-validation. So even taking the time to acknowledge, like, I'm having this emotional experience, acknowledging what's happening with your emotions, with your mind, with your body, how you're feeling about things, that is a form of validation. Just even acknowledging this is here, this emotion is here, this experience is here, is a level of validation. And then if we follow that up with action, like not only am I acknowledging what I'm feeling, but I'm following up on it for myself. I'm taking action on it. And this could be broken down into very small pieces, like with the please skill. So the please skill is drawing from this concept that I've listed on the other side of the slide. Taking care of your body is taking care of your mind. So when we're experiencing a lot of distress, some of the things that can be put on the back burner are these basic things that our bodies need. Um, taking our medications as prescribed, and um, if we're not, if we're feeling pain or sick or something, like following up with getting medical care, getting enough nutrition, getting sleep. One of the things that can come up is like thinking about how we're engaging with mood altering substances. That's the term we use, or drugs. How are we leaning into those to support us? Is that the most effective thing in terms of how it impacts our bodies? And then movement. So these are all pieces that are, common recommendations around self-care. And where are we at with those? Depending on how stressed we're feeling, we may be more or less attentive to these areas, and they can make a huge difference in terms of how we're feeling. So those are other areas that we can practice self-validation, like, oh, I'm tired. What can I do to rest? What can I do to get more sleep? So I'm acknowledging my experience and attending to it. I'm thirsty. I'm hungry. Following up with getting something to eat or drink. And I understand, and I also want to note that it's not always accessible. Part of why our bodies might not be taken care of is because we are um, under-resourced, or our families are under-resourced, or we're experiencing discrimination. So I know that it's not always easy, but where can we? Where do we have some choice to take care of our bodies, um, and offer ourselves that level of validation? So, along with that, I also want to acknowledge is how these things and many other things can be vulnerability factors. So, vulnerability factors are things that can make you more vulnerable or likely or susceptible to have emotional reactions to things. So, with this climate crisis, we're carrying a lot of emotional vulnerability. So, that may play out in situations when we are dealing with situations related to climate change or not, or it can show up in other areas of our lives. So it is so important to try where we can to manage these vulnerabilities. So just to give an example of that, like maybe you've heard the term hangry before, like and I struggle with this sometimes, like I'm hungry, I don't have the nutrition I need, and so I'm more agitated or irritable. So that makes me more vulnerable to having an emotional reaction or a more intense emotional reaction. And so what are the things that we can do to really take really good care of ourselves to manage those vulnerabilities so we can be more effective in terms of how we're engaging with things? Something to sort of consider is part of this process of validation is we can really sit with like what information are your emotions giving to you? And how do you want to respond? What's the most effective way of responding to them or moving forward in a situation? I just want to note this chain briefly. Like these are check the facts, opposite action, problem solving are pretty big skills. So I'm not going to go so much into them, but sometimes, so just in general, it can be helpful to take a step back and think about our emotional reaction and what may be triggering it. Um, is it that I'm assuming sort of a worst case scenario that something bad will happen? Is it related to the way I'm interpreting a situation? And am I reacting on, versus like, what are the actual facts? Are there other ways of interpreting this? And if there's a mismatch between like what makes sense, like with the situation I'm in, what makes sense in terms of the emotion that it makes sense to be feeling, or how intense it makes sense to be feeling it, or how long it's been lasting. Um, does that really fit with the facts that I have or with the situation that I'm in? Or is there something off there? So it can be a way to sort of put your cards on the table and assess, like, is there anything I'm missing here? Um, am I reacting based on the situation that's in front of me or something that, um, or is it more so based on something that's happened in the past? So sometimes these skills can be helpful in terms of figuring out what's the most effective way of moving forward. A couple of notes with this. Want to acknowledge that sometimes people perceive the check the facts skill as quite invalidating because, again, it's going to that idea that I mentioned earlier of like, oh, you're thinking about it wrong. And that's not the intent of the skill. The intent of the skill, as I see it, as I use it, is like, I'm going to put everything down on paper and I'm going to take a look at it. Almost like I was, sometimes I think about this with like tarot cards, where you like ask a question and you're looking at a situation, you put all your cards on the table. And then when you have all your cards on the table, that may give you a different perspective of like what's happening and how you want to move forward with something and kind of make sense of things. And so these are some skills that can help us with that. Um, Opposite action is not always helpful for every nervous system. So just want to note that. Um, and also that this is a particularly sticky area when we are working with our climate distress because there's so much argument about what are the facts, or can we believe the facts? Can we acknowledge the facts? And how overwhelming it might be when we actually do acknowledge the facts. So we'll talk about that a little bit more with radical acceptance, but I just want to acknowledge that there may be some sensitivity around these skills and that they may or may not be helpful for you, but you can, they're there if you think they would be helpful. Interpersonal effectiveness. So, again, there's a lot to these skills. I've listed off some of the skill names, similarly to the last slide, if you want to research them more in some of the self-help materials that links that I'll send you. But one of the things we can think about with interpersonal effectiveness is weighing out our priorities. So, one of the things we think about with DBT is that in any given interaction, interpersonal interaction, interaction with another person, there's three different levels at play. There's the objective. Why are we having this conversation? What am I trying to get out of this conversation? What's the point of it? What's the purpose of it? What do I hope to accomplish? There's the relationship. How important is this relationship to you? How do you want the other person to feel about you after this interaction? Then there's self-respect. How do I want to feel about myself after the conversation? So that's more thinking about our values, our integrity. And this is one of the most tricky areas with these issues because it is such a politicized topic and because there is this back and forth politically. There may be situations where we are trying to engage with someone on these topics, whether it's a family, whether it's a friend, whether it's, we're tabling somewhere and we're trying to communicate and educate different things to people, that these are maybe some skills that would be helpful to sort of discern how and when to advocate, what boundaries are important to put in place to take care of yourself in terms of how you're communicating. Is there an imbalance in your in the way you're communicating? Um, are you suppressing your own needs and things that are important to you because it will make other people more comfortable, for example? And so one of the things I want to note that part of why communication is so difficult is that, especially when we are trying to communicate these sort of in these intense situations, is that our emotions are running alongside our communication. So we have to have almost two sets of skills here. We have to have our communication skills. We also have to think about, how am I managing my emotions while I'm communicating? And that can get really tricky when we have intense emotions around these topics. So again, another reason for working on emotion skills with managing our emotions and taking care of our emotional health, because that will help us to be better advocates. That will help us to communicate more effectively. The other thing that we can sort of invite in is stepping out of that political realm that sort of paints people maybe as enemies or good and bad. Again, we're already talking about challenging those assumptions with mindfulness, but sort of to also hold, maybe, where is this other person coming from? What are their values? What is important to them? What are their motivations? What is appealing to them about this other view? How is that playing out? And the more that we learn about what's going on with this person, maybe that can help us to have more effective communication. So also part of the interpersonal effectiveness is validation skills. We talked about self-validation with managing our emotions. We can also learn more skills about how to engage in a way that expresses that the other what the other person might be feeling and experiencing is understandable. Like if you learn more about this person and their background, their context, it may or may not, maybe not always, be understandable why they are maybe struggling to accept the things that you're saying or open to your to the facts. Um, there may be some things that we can discover that might actually help us be more effective in communicating. Is the other person feeling threatened or having a strong fear response? So that's also something else. The more that we understand our emotions and learn about emotions, we may be able to understand or see or notice more of what the other person is experiencing, and that may help us to be more effective as well with our communication. So, distress tolerance. So as I mentioned, this is split up into two sections. So these are the crisis survival skills. So one thing I didn't note about the emotion regulation skills is that they are more so thinking about mid-level emotions. So if you're thinking about emotional intensity on a scale of like 0 to no emotions at all to 100, like the most intense or stressful emotions you could think of, that the emotion regulation is probably 75 or lower level of intensity, where distress tolerance is like 75 plus. So these are when we are in crisis, when we are having intense emotional reactions, panic, overwhelm, we're going to be having strong urges to engage in ineffective behaviors. So really overwhelmed. So here's where mindfulness comes in again. We have the stop skill, which is in essence what it says, to stop. So when we're building up the mindfulness skills, building up that self-awareness, we're more likely to be able to catch ourselves if, like, oh, you're having a strong emotional reaction right now. Something is happening, something is off. So to pause and take a step back and consider what's the most effective way of moving forward. Noticing what's going on with you, how to move forward in a way that makes the most sense for you, what's most effective for you. So this is sort of just like we talked about, like mindfulness is a foundation for all the other skills. We've got to first build in this awareness. And I often encourage people, you don't always have to be in crisis to practice the stop skill. This is an excellent skill to just even take a pause or two throughout your day to just check in. What am I noticing about my experience? And is there anything that my system is asking me to do in terms of how to attend to this? Um, wise mind accept. So distracting with wise mind accept. So again, there's a lot to this, but one thing I wanted to just make note of is sort of this discussion around distraction versus avoidance. So, distraction sometimes can be the most effective thing to do. Sometimes that's survival. Sometimes that's getting through to the other side. Like our nervous systems need a break. They need pacing. They need a breather to just get our minds off of it. So at some point, if we are distracting for a certain amount, a certain amount of time, that may go into avoidance, and avoidance may no longer be effective. We're not dealing with things that we need to deal with. Things are piling up. We're not, again, living in a way that's in line with our values. And so I think that's a really important concept, that being mindful of where we might cross that line, like what that line looks like for us in particular. Like I know for me, it's actually a certain number of shows. Like that's where, sort of the Netflix thing where it just like keeps playing the next episode. As much as that may feel good in the beginning, at some point, I will watch one too many shows and I really don't feel good after that. So that's again part of building this mindful awareness of you, and like being honest with yourself about what actually is effective for me, what actually is working for me, and what is not. And also to take out the shame that all of our most of us, if not all of us, have. I mean, we all have a certain level of capacity with our nervous systems. And that capacity may fluctuate or shift from day to day, from time to time. And we may have more or less capacity to face things, to look in the eyes of of this thing that we're scared of or overwhelmed by. And so what's an effective way to work with that? What's an effective way to give ourselves a breather so that we can restabilize? And there's a lot more ideas of how to practice this that you can look up. And then self-soothe is thinking about skills that, so this really is a mindfulness practice. So this is another example of mindfulness here of like things that are soothing to our system, soothing to our nervous system, whether that is like different things with our I mean, where it's mostly focused on is thinking about our five senses, is like what feels good for our senses, and really giving our full attention to it. Like, for example, if one of the things I love uh, is the smell of lavender. And so taking a moment to just breathe that in and really give it my full attention is something that can be very soothing for my system. We can also think about things that are soothing to different levels of our nervous systems, like doing things like stimming or fidget toys, doing things that I can never say this word, proprioception, but there's something that can be soothing, like some people like weighted blankets, things like weightlifting or chewing gum, like that can be soothing to our system, doing things that sort of silence stuff that is too intense. So, like wearing sunglasses or headphones. So, thinking about what feels good for your system. This can help you to calm your nervous system down. Improve the moment, which you might notice, like these words that I write out. I realize I didn't mention that where they're all capital letters, is these are actually acronyms. And so each letter stands for a different skill. But a couple things that you can think about from improve the moment is doing things like intentionally doing things that feel relaxing to you, or doing things that give you a greater sense of meaning. That there's some sort of a greater purpose to maybe the difficulty that you're experiencing in the moment. Like, and that's very tricky with this. I get that, because that could go in different directions. But for some people, that can be helpful to really be in tune with what they're doing and why they're doing it. So, so these skills can really help us in sort of noticing, like, when is something, recognizing when something is activating us and taking a step back and attending to it. So a lot of the stuff I've already talked about, but yeah, actually I've covered all that. So go to the next one. Reality acceptance skills. So this is a big one. This is a big one with this situation. And I think, different people have different perspectives on this. Like different people have different perspectives on hope. And I've talked about, or I've heard from many people over the years that talk about the challenge of maintaining hope, or like, I have to maintain this hope and communicate it to these students or these people in the community. How do I do this when I'm faced with the science that we're looking at and the facts that we're looking at? And then some people have taken the approach of um, maybe that's not a helpful way of doing things. Maybe a more helpful way of doing things is coming to terms with where we're at. And different people have different ideas of what hope means. Um, I'm particularly pulling from things I've learned about post-doom, which is, as it says, like getting past I don't know if maybe you've read articles or seen things about doomers, like just focusing on the doom and gloom of things, of how bad things are. And post-doom is like, okay, now what? What do we do? So to me, it's really, when I learned about it, I was like, oh, this is radical acceptance. So really facing like, okay, this is where we're at. Like, this is how bad things are. This is how um, difficult, our future looks, how bleak our future looks. And now what? What do we do? How do we go forward from here? So radical acceptance is not you agree with something. It's not that you're okay with it. It's not that you're against action either. In this sense, what acceptance means is these are the facts. This is the situation I'm actually in versus the situation I'd like to be in or I wish I was in. And when we come to terms with that, we can grieve. There's a whole lot of grief there that people that are go, 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 action, action, action are not facing. And maybe find themselves, I'm not saying everybody is like that, but some people find themselves in a place where they're running. They're running from these emotions and they're running from where we're actually at and what we're actually facing. And so, one of the things that can be beautiful about the grieving process, as overwhelming and painful as it can be, is that may clear some space for us to discover or imagine new possibilities. Because what we may find is that we're spending a lot on investing in things that are already lost in a reality that is no longer possible. And then we might be not, we may not be as effective with what we're doing because we're investing in things that are not possible. When we have an opportunity to grieve and face the reality that we're in, and with the reality that we're in, we can think about what actually is doable here. What actually makes sense here? What is the most effective use of our time and our energy? So, radical acceptance here is not thought of as just one and done. Like I've accepted it and I'm good. It is an active practice. Our level of acceptance might shift from day to day, moment to moment. We may not know. Some days have to practice at all. We may not have to practice at all that day. And then some days it may be multiple times a day. It may be multiple times an hour because of how intensely we are struggling to accept this reality. So, turning the mind is this concept of when I am at that crossroads, actively choosing to move towards acceptance. Willingness is practicing a willingness to do what is needed, to showing up in a way to meet the demands that a situation is expecting of us. Meet the demands of the situation that we're in. Again, versus the situation we wish we were in, that we hope that we would like to be in, but what's the situation that we're actually in, and what does that demand of us? Practices like half smile and willing hands are sort of thinking through how can we embody that sense of acceptance for where we are? How can we hold that stance in terms of how we're carrying ourselves to open to what is? And again, I want to go back to this concept of acceptance and how it is not against change. This is one of the big dialectics. So this is what I'll talk more about that in a moment. But what dialectical means is there can be two things that seem opposing and are both true, like acceptance and change. Those seem opposing when, for example, the reality is I have to first accept the situation that I'm in. I have to acknowledge it, acknowledge what I'm actually dealing with in order to even be able to think about change, in order to even think about like what change might be possible to actually address a situation. So, a little bit more about dialectics. So, I've already talked about some of this concept. But there's a lot more to this, but these are a couple of things that I pulled from The dialectics material is this concept of walking the middle path, again, taken straight from Buddhism. Let's be real about that. Let's acknowledge it. Um, Staying away from extremes, but also sort of acknowledging that everything is connected and that separation is an illusion. So these are big concepts, and these are actually scientific realities. We live in a interconnected, interdependent, intersubjective universe. How does that play out in terms of how we're engaging and how we're understanding the situation that we're in? Are we falling for this illusion of uh, separation? How much suffering is there? Um, that change, how much suffering are we experiencing, and have we as a community been experiencing because of this investment in this idea of separation? Change is the only constant. So, as we talked about with mindfulness, like things are constantly changing. We have an ever-changing reality, and that change is transactional. I am both impacted by the change and I can impact the change. So, holding both sides of that reality. Um, this is a common one that we also talk about with DBT is I'm doing the best I can and I may need to do better. The situation may be demanding more of me. And so how do we hold both sides of that and not go into shame? Am I caught up in sort of all or none thinking? And we've already talked about this idea of exploring or playing with this idea of where is the other side coming from? Where are these other people that are opposed to us or pushing back on us? Like, where are they coming from? Are there any similarities? And embracing the confusion of the both and versus the either or. So these are pretty big concepts that I am not in this short presentation going to try to fully simplify, but maybe things to think about. Are there pieces here that could support your work in holding the complexity of what you're dealing with, how you are moving through the world and facing these challenges, how we as a community are, and other people are, and how they're responding or not responding to the situation? Because potentially that may not seem in the, in that very action oriented, doing mind sort of way, seem like it's going to be helpful. And we don't know that if we don't know what will come, like how much more effective we may be able to be if we hold this complexity for ourselves, if we hold this complexity for other people, like what may come of that in terms of our movement work. So I also wanted to highlight a little bit more about Buddhism and climate change. So I went through a couple of resources and articles that talked about Buddhism and climate change. And some of the pieces that Buddhist leaders and teachers brought up about their investment and understanding and things that they were advocating for in terms of addressing climate change. And on the other side, so that's on the left side of the screen, and then on the right side, some of the things that they saw as getting in the way or causing or contributing to climate change. So some of these we've already talked about, these concepts from Buddhism: interconnectedness, compassion, mutual interdependence. We are interdependent. This is a big challenge, the way that many of us in Western cultures, white Western cultures, were raised, socialized, is that we are independent, that we could be interdependent, when in reality, we are completely dependent. We are interdependent on other beings, other species. Our lives depend on them. Concepts of community, like operating as acknowledging that we are in community, the importance of cooperation, the beauty and dignity of more than human beings. So acknowledging the inherent value of our more than human relations, the non-dual reality. So the dualism might be getting caught in that illusion of separation, the importance of peace, generosity, and kindness in how we engage in the world. And that some of the challenges some of these teachers were seeing is a lack of insight, awareness, concern, consumption, ignorance, discrimination, fear, violence, greed, mindlessness, and indifference. How these are all things that can be noted and from a Buddhist perspective that are contributing to those issues. So I just wanted to take at least a moment to acknowledge again where it's often not, where DBT's roots are in Buddhism, and acknowledge how the Buddhist community is both acknowledging and grappling with climate change as well. So here are some resources. So I talked about the Climate Psychology Alliance. So Climate Psychology Alliance has the directory of climate psychologists. I'm also going to list a couple of other resources in the show notes. And these are some of the DBT links that I mentioned, where you can get more information about self-support. If you want to learn more, look into some of these acronyms I talked about, think through those skills and how they might help you. Some of the podcasts that might be helpful in supporting you with your climate emotions, and some other helpful websites related to climate change and mental health. Here are some of my references. Just want to say thank you for joining me today. Again, there's a lot more to this topic, so much more that we could cover, but just wanted to do a little bit of an overview with some ideas, and hopefully some of those will be helpful to you. And don't hesitate to reach out to me or other. I'll give some more links, like I said, if you want to find therapists from a climate aware perspective or DBT perspective that might be able to support you as we're dealing with this significant existential crisis. I hope that you are able to find the support that you need as we move through this together. Thank you.